She was cleaning 13 markers in the snow when the rider came up the lane. That was how Cal Beckett's mornings had come to be measured for 15 years now. Not by the sun, not by the clock above the kitchen stove, but by the careful work of brushing pine needles from each small cross, scraping lichen off each carved name, tightening the markers that had begun to lean in the wind. 13 of them stood in a tidy row on the high square of ground at the center of the eastern 80. 13 strangers who had died on his land, and 13 strangers whose names he had learned or guessed or stitched together from the letters and tokens he kept in a tin beneath the floorboards of his cabin. He was 61 years old and 3 months through it. The wind off the Bighorn had been cutting all morning, the kind of cold that came into a man's lungs and stayed there. His breath made small ghosts above each marker as he worked from one end of the row to the other, and the new snow was coming down in slow, heavy flakes that did not intend to stop. Already the morning's work had stiffened his hands inside his gloves. He did not let himself notice it, the way a man does not let himself notice that the woodbox is lighter than it was at the beginning of the season. The Bighorn was still making its sound this morning, that deep, throaty sound she had grown used to. She had been at the east pasture once, in late summer, and a calf had come up and pressed its warm nose into the palm of her hand, and she had stood very still and had not cried, even though she did not know why she wanted to. She had fed that calf twice a day for the rest of the week and had refused, afterward, to let herself name it. The first marker was the oldest, Thomas Whitfield, age 17, 1876. Cal had found the boy in a dry wash that summer, his lips still parted around a name he had been trying to call. Cal had carried water to him in a tin cup, and then carried him to higher ground when there was no one left to carry water to. The boy had a tin plate in his pocket with the name printed clean, the way plates are printed for young men going out from farms to start a life in cattle. Cal had carved the marker himself that autumn, his hand still learning what a heartbroken word looked like in juniper. The second was Sarah Jane Calloway, 1879. She had been found beside an overturned canvas wagon on the trail south of the homestead, her hands still folded around the bundle she had been carrying, which turned out to be her living daughter, 3 days old and breathing in that quiet, stubborn way that newborns have of announcing they will not quit. Cal had ridden through the snow to the Nelson place 2 miles south, and the Nelsons had taken the babe. Etta Calloway, 23 now, sometimes walked past his gate on her way to her cousin's house and waved at him with the kind of wave that did not know what it meant to owe a person anything. He moved down the row. Brother Ezekiel Pine, 1878, a traveling preacher who had crawled into his woodshed the night of the great storm and been found that spring with his Bible still open at the 3rd chapter of John, his finger laid against a verse he had not finished reading aloud. Marisol del Rio, 1881, a young Mexican woman who had walked away from the cholera camps at the railroad crossing and walked until she could not walk anymore, her husband's wedding ring on a string around her neck, the ring itself too small for a man and too worn for a stranger. Levi Hutchins, 1880, a boy of 12 running from something Cal had not been able to ask about, his pockets filled with a torn letter Cal had read once and never read again, because some things in a boy's pockets are his and his alone, even after the boy is gone. Captain Aldous Renwick, 1882, a man who walked like a soldier and died like one, in the small hours of a March morning, his boots neatly beside his bedroll. Hannah Greer, 1883, so slight under a juniper that Cal had not seen her at first until his horse had nearly stepped on her hand, her fingers still curled around a sprig of chokecherry she had been holding when her breathing stopped. Jedediah Tate, 1884, a schoolmaster Cal had invited in for coffee and watched walk across the swollen bridge the next morning, hat in his hand, his body found at low water 3 miles downstream with the hat washed up 2 days later against a fence post. Elena Vasquez, 1885, 19 years old, who had come up his lane on a borrowed horse with blood on her sleeves and no voice left to explain what had happened to her family back down the river. She had asked him to keep the babe if the babe came, and the babe had come too soon and silent. Silas Holloman, 1886. Cal could still see him pressed against the broken fence post, as if he had been trying to climb it. Ruth Bellamy, 1887, who had stepped off the train platform and turned left when the town she had been sent to meet turned away from her at the steps of the depot. John Caleb Morrow, 1888, a freedman looking for honest work, who had stood in Cal's yard one afternoon and wept because Cal had asked him in for a meal, and who had died a week later of wounds he had not shown to anyone until they were too late to mend. Lily Mae Forsyth, 1889, who had wandered off in the night and been found at dawn curled against the long stone at the field's edge, for years old and not yet understanding the difference between lost and gone. 13 names carved into 13 pieces of wood. 13 people who had crossed Cal's land on their way to or from somewhere else, and whom Cal had refused, in his own quiet and stubborn way, to let the country swallow whole. He was finishing the last marker when he heard the horse. The sound of hooves on frozen ground. Expensive hooves, the kind of horse that did not belong at the end of this road. He stood up slowly, brushing the snow from his knees, and looked toward the lane. Many of you who listen to these stories have told me you cook or knit or wind down to them in the evening. Tonight, I'd love to know where you are. Drop a quick hello in the comments. Town, country, anywhere. I'd love to keep you company for the next hour. He did not know the man on the horse. He knew the kind of man. The cut of his long coat, the polish on the leather, the way his eyes walked over the land as though the land were already entered in some greater figure on some larger ledger in some larger room back east. In some office Cal had never been inside and would not be welcomed into. The man's name was Lyman Worthington, and he had come about the Eastern 80. The Eastern 80 was the back half of Cal's ranch, the grazing pasture that ran down to the river and joined the high square of ground at its center where the 13 markers stood. A man could be a fool to refuse good money for it. Worthington's first offer had been $10,000, paid in gold. Cal had counted it once, because gold makes a certain small sound against a kitchen table. He had counted it, and the count had been wrong somewhere in his chest. Son, Worthington had begun. Not for any number you have on that horse. Worthington had smiled then, the way a man smiles at a child who has said something foolish but has said it sincerely. He had laid out the survey plane, the spur line the company was planning, the post road, the way the territory needed to be opened, the way the Eastern 80 could not continue to sit empty when there were cattle to move. He had explained it with the patient ease of a man whose arguments had already been typed up by someone else's hand. The Eastern 80 will be condemned through the county in 6 weeks one way or another, Mr. Beckett. You can take the gold as a courtesy, or you can take less once the lawyers are done. Cal had known it was so. The county wanted the spur. Worthington had built half of the county already, did most of the hiring, signed most of the notes. He had put a new roof on the church in Calder in 1879. He had bought the widow Marsh's mortgage in 1880. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was a man whose patience had been sharpened on a stone nobody else knew about, and his patience was running low. The lawyer whose office Cal had visited once, after reading the same notice posted in the post office window, had looked at him across a desk piled with other men's fates. You could fight it, the lawyer had said. You could hire me. I cannot hire you. No, the lawyer had said. You couldn't. But Cal had not sold. He had not sold because the Eastern 80 was joined at its center to the small square of high ground where the 13 markers stood. The road Worthington wanted would have come straight through them. Cal had said nothing about the markers to the lawyer. He had said nothing about the markers to anyone in 15 years. That was the bare shape of his trouble. He had kept a cemetery on his land, and the land was wanted, and he had not told a soul. If he told now, the oldest men in town would call it superstition. The younger men would call it madness. The women might call it grief, but Cal did not have any of those names for what it was. What it was, he had carried 13 strangers out of snow and dust and river current, and he had buried them, and he had given each one a marker because they had each one had a name. That was all. He talked to them at sunset, walking the row, his hands at his sides. I'm sorry, he would say. I did not know how to do better. He had been saying that for 15 years, and he was not yet tired of it, because a man owes a truth like that to the dead, and the debt does not stop being owed when he has paid it once. A name carved into a piece of wood lasts longer than a man does. He had known that since the first marker. He had not known it would be the small lesson his whole life bent itself around. The morning after Worthington's visit, Cal was at the kitchen window when he saw a woman walking up the front path with a satchel in her hand. She had a careful face, the kind of face that has learned to keep its breath. Her clothes had been folded and refolded along the seams the way a widow's clothes are. Her bootlaces were tied in a double knot from long habit. He went to open the door before she knocked. Her name was Mira Holloway. Her husband Eli had been crushed in a copper accident in Butte 2 years before this. She had come west because he had come west, and there had been no one left for her back in Ohio. She said she was looking for a place to board through the season. She asked about the ranch. She asked about his fences. She asked about his cattle by their markings. Older, harder, the way a woman asks who has handled her own stock once. Then she asked, in the offhand way of a woman who had spent most of her life being told how to answer, if there was a cemetery anywhere near. Cal had felt the question land behind his ribs. There's a stand of pines, he had said, and pointed in the wrong direction, and paid for the lie in his sleep that night. She was quiet around the ranch for the first 10 days. She set stores by his window. She fed the horses. She learned the names of his cattle by ear and the names of his dogs by heart. She did not press him. She did not ask about the tin beneath the floorboards. She did not see him step out at dawn with his sketchbook and his carving knife and walk to the high ground to tighten a marker that did not always need tightening. She had her own griefs and was not yet ready to ask what his were made of. On the 11th day, she walked toward the eastern 80 alone. He came up the rise behind her at his steady walk and found her standing at the row's edge, her hand to her mouth. And in that long suspended moment, he understood what was about to be lost. They say these are strangers, she said. Yes. Strangers you buried alone. Each one, he said. Each one alone, and each one named. He went to his knees at the first marker and brushed the snow from the lettering, the way a man might brush dirt from a wound that had stopped bleeding. He told her, then, the small piece of each one, not in order, not all at once, only the part each had left behind. The tin plate, the folded Bible, the wedding ring on a string, the double-knotted laces. By the time he had finished, the sun was on the row. Mira sat down beside the first marker and laid her hand flat against it, the way one lays a hand against a sleeping child. A week later, Worthington sent his foreman. Have you ever carried a small private thing for so long you forgot it was a kindness? Hold that question as we go forward. His name was Bert Stryker. He came up the lane with 2 surveyors and a wagon. His men had long, bright instruments and short opinions. They began setting stakes that afternoon, beginning at the eastern fence and marching west in a straight line that pointed toward the heart of the row, each stake driven quick and hard, the way a man drives a stake when he is sure no one is going to argue with him. Cal watched from the porch. He did not go inside. He did not shout. When Stryker and his men had worked their way to within 100 yards of the markers, Cal walked across the field and stood at the first cross, his hands at his sides. Sir, Stryker said, step aside. No, this is county work. We have the papers. Cal did not step aside. Stryker struck him once across the side of the face with the back of his hand. Cal took the blow without falling. He did not step aside. The blood came at his hairline, and the snow on his collar turned pink at the edges. The foreman took a step closer. He was a full head taller. Old man, you have one chance to walk away from this. There are people who... I will not. The surveyors lowered their instruments. Stryker went red up the side of his neck. The moment held like a held breath. Then, from the stand of pines at the row's western edge, Mira Holloway stepped out into the open, with the tin under one arm and Cal's sketchbook under the other. She had read the law the night before by the kitchen fire. Her husband Eli had been a clerk in a courthouse before the copper accident, and she had kept 2 of his books. She had understood in less than an hour what Cal had not bothered to learn. Each grave on private land was a recorded thing in the county register once the grave was marked. To move them required state papers, public notice, kin. There was no moving a row of marked graves for a spur line. There was no moving them at all unless the kin said so. Stryker looked at her. He looked at Cal. He looked at the tin. Each one, she said, has a name. Stryker spat into the snow. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at Cal one more time, and something in Cal's face made him turn his horse and motion the surveyors to pack up their bright instruments. He did not come back the next day, but the stakes stood where they had been driven. And at the end of that week, a quiet word had passed through Calder, the county seat, that there was a man up at the Beckett place who had a cemetery of strangers on his land, and who had been writing letters to find their kin. It was the writing of the letters that changed the season. Cal did not know how to write to people he had not met. He sat at the kitchen table 3 nights running with the tin in front of him and did not open it. Mira finally sat down across from him and said, begin with the name. Begin there. He wrote. He had not been a tender man. He had not been a fast writer. His hand cramped, and Mira took the pen from him on the second hour, and he dictated the rest to her, and her hand was surer than his, and what came out on the paper was something neither of them could have written alone. He had, by morning, 11 letters drafted and 3 sealed. The first was addressed to a woman in St. Louis who had been wondering for 19 years what had become of her brother Tom. She had been 21 when her brother Tom had gone out on the cattle drive. She was 40 now, with children of her own, and a daughter named for the brother. She wrote back in a careful, neat script that Cal had to read by candlelight. She said she had carried a photograph of Tom in her apron pocket for 19 years. She asked, please, if he had any of his things. He did. The tin plate was still in Cal's kitchen drawer, where he had kept it. He wrapped it, and Mira wrote out the paper for him, and he sent it down the road with the stage driver that week. He wrote nothing grand in the note that went with it. He wrote, he was trying to say something when it happened. I think he was trying to say your name. The sister wrote back. She wrote back that she had sat down on her porch when the package arrived and held the plate for 1 hour. She wrote that she had not cried since her mother passed. She wrote, I will come to see him standing in the earth if I can. Other notes came. A daughter in Cheyenne who had not seen her father, Captain Renwick, since before the war, and who had believed him killed at Shiloh. She had a daughter of her own now, 10 years old, named for him. A man in Minneapolis who said he had been a pupil of the schoolmaster Tate, and that the schoolmaster had been the only adult that year to ask him how he was, and that he had carried that question in his pocket like a coin. A boy with a Hibbing address, small for his age, who said his grandmother had been a Calloway, and that his great-aunt Etta had once spoken of a man on a ranch who had brought her in from the snow, and that he would like, when he was older, to come out and shake the hand of any man left alive who had been gentle to a stranger. Each one wrote carefully. Each one asked questions Cal could finally answer. Each one, in their quiet way, closed a loop that had been open for years. Cal wrote back. He wrote to each, and Mira helped him, and they sat up over the tin and the candle into the small hours, and the candle burned low and they did not replace it, because the dark made them more truthful. Cal walked up the row every night after the candles were out. He went without the lantern when the moon was up, but did not do so by his own reckoning of courage. He had simply always felt it was the right way to walk among the dead, the way a man would walk into a friend's parlor without ceremony. He laid his hand on the first marker one night and said Tom's sister's name into the wind. He had not known he kept it. He had somehow held it for 19 years in some quiet drawer of himself, the way a man keeps a piece of string he cannot bring himself to throw away. Mira, he said, when he came back in, would you be willing to stay on past the snow? Yes, she said. I would. I have been waiting for someone to ask. In late winter, one of the letters brought a reply that was not a kind one. It came from a man calling himself a relative of John Caleb Morrow, and it said the marker was a foolishness, that Cal had no right, and that the body should have been left to rot in the ravine where he had carried him from. Cal read the letter 3 times. He folded it. He started to put it in the fire, and Mira said, Cal, no, let it be. He had the right to write that. Cal walked the row that night with his hands heavier than usual, and at the Morrow marker he stood for a long time. He had not built a monument. He had buried a man who needed burying. He did not write back to that relative. He did not mend his kindness because someone had called it foolish. He went to the carver's shop in the county seat the next morning with Mira and bought a fresh piece of juniper and brought it home and carved a clean second cross beside Morrow's marker with the same name, and stood back, and the wind came up gently that evening, and he carried the letter inside and laid it in the fire. He had buried strangers in silence because that was the only dignity he knew what to do with. Now the strangers had names that other people carried. Now 13 families, somewhere, knew where their dead had come to rest. If the feeling you carried through that quiet scene just now is one you'd like to come back to, that small kind of being seen, the simplest way to find your way back is to subscribe. And if you think someone you love deserves a story like this one, the like is the way you tell us. Either of them is a kindness, and Cal would understand. In April, Worthington came back. He came back personally. He came back with 2 lawyers, a man from the survey office, and a clerk from the county. He came back because the spur had been pushed back a half-year somewhere in a boardroom in Omaha, and he had come to find out why the place he had been promised empty was not. He came up the lane, and the eastern 80 was still unfenced, still unraised, still in Cal's name. He came up the lane, and he found it full of people. There were 11 families standing in the row in their careful clothes, with their hands on the markers they had come to see. There were 5 men from the Methodist Church in Calder who had carried him books up the rise. There was Etta Calloway, 23 now, holding a folded blanket against her chest that had been her mother's. There was a boy of 14 from Hibbing, small for his age, standing beside the Calloway marker with the metal letters of his grandmother pinned to the inside of his coat. There was a woman from Cheyenne who had not laid her hand on her father's marker in 19 years, and who was laying it there now. Worthington stopped his horse at the gate. The clerk from the county looked at the people. The lawyers looked at the lawyers. Stryker, who had come along, looked at Stryker. "They are kin," Cal said. 11 words. He had rehearsed them in his head for 6 weeks. "They have come from Missouri, from Minnesota, from Cheyenne, from 100 places. They have come to stand with the dead you would have run a road through. The spur does not go here." Worthington looked at the tidy row. He looked at the hands on the markers. He looked at the way Etta Calloway was weeping into the folded blanket, and at the way the hymn books were open to the same page in every hand. He took a slow, even breath. "The spur," he said, "can go around." He turned his horse. The clerk followed. The lawyers followed. The surveyors who had come with them walked back the way they had come, carrying their long, bright instruments over their shoulders like rifles held at rest. The Eastern 80 was not sold that day. It was not sold the next month. Wickham's spur went through the Henderson place 5 miles south, where there were no strangers buried, and where the price of the land was smaller, and where the road looked the same on every map. Cal did not gloat. He did not speak much, in fact, for several weeks. He went up the row each morning. He spoke the names. He tightened the markers that had begun to lean. He let Mira bring him coffee. He let her stay. In early June, on a morning when the air was so clear you could still see the snow on the high passes, Cal stood at the row's edge and turned to Mira and asked her to marry him. She had been a widow for 9 years, and she knew what it was to be asked, and she knew what it was not to be asked, and she said yes without making him wait. They were married a week later in the row by the Methodist pastor who had been standing there at the snowfall of the previous winter. They did not invite many. They invited the families whose kin rested there, and the people who had helped carry letters, and Etta Calloway, who sang a small hymn her mother had taught her, which no one had ever heard, and the singing was very quiet, and had a small place reserved inside it for the man who had been her mother's last warmth. The singing was very quiet, and no one clapped when it was done, and the silence after was the kind of silence that is its own applause. That evening Cal walked the row with Mira at his side. He had been a young man once, and now he was 62, and there were some who would say he should not have started again at his age. He would have agreed with them except for the fact that Mira had been broken too, and she had been willing to be known. Several counties away there was a sister in St. Louis who had hung Cal's letter on her parlor wall, and several counties above there was a boy in Hibbing who would grow up to go out to a place he had not yet seen, where a man had once kept his grandmother safe for one night in a broken canvas. The world does not always know what it owes to the quiet ones. It pays when it can. The first heavy snow of the new winter came in late October. Cal was 63 by then. Mira was beside him at the kitchen window when the flakes began, and she set down her cup and said, "It is time." They walked up the rise with the lantern held low. The light moved up the row and over the names: Thomas, Sarah Jane, Brother Ezekiel, Marisol, Levi, Captain Renwick, Hannah, Jedediah, Elena, Silas, Ruth Bellamy, John Caleb, Lily Mae, and at the end of the row Cal stopped and set his hand on the 13th cross and said the names one more time into the falling snow, because a man does not stop saying the names just because other people have come to say them too. He said them softer now, and Mira did not interrupt, and the light from the lantern did not tremble. He brushed the snow from Lily Mae's marker with his sleeve, the way a man might brush a girl's hair from her face. A name is the smallest thing a person can carry into the next life. It costs nothing to give. It is everything not to. He lifted the wick just a little so the light would last them on the walk back, and the snow was falling so slowly that it did not seem to be falling at all, and his shadow fell ahead of them down the path, and behind them 13 small crosses stood in a row beside each other in the snow. Tomorrow night, I'll be telling you the story of a woman who kept a stranger's grave for 20 years without knowing why, and the man from the past who finally came home to thank her. I think you'll want to be there, wherever you are tonight. Thank you for keeping me company. Rest well.